Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And in our couple minutes talking beforehand, my guest was, or our guest was already playing to type in a way that made me excited for this conversation. So for those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work. We take your questions about work. And today I'm here with Annie Duke, who is a decision strategist who I became aware of in recent years because of her last book, Thinking in Bets, and the current book, which is called Quit, which we'll talk a little bit about, is I have yet to have a chance to read, but I'm excited to. And in a past life, Annie was a professional poker player. And so there's a way that she thinks about the information you need to make decisions. And then, I'll just say, we co-invested in a company, and the founder said, Annie, that you were the single most helpful investor to him in his highest stakes negotiations, which my guess is that's exactly what you want to hear. So,
well, thank you. I do coach them on all of their negotiations, and I love
great.
them. I think they're super smart.
So for a regular working person, a typical question they might face is, I'm in a job and in some ways it seems okay. In some ways, it, like any job, it has some good, it has some bad. How do I know when it's time for me to go?
Yeah, so it's such a great question. And there's two answers that I have, sort of two ways that I think about it. The first is, if you're thinking about it, it's definitely, you should be exploring it. And the reason that you should be exploring it is that in general, when it comes to decisions about whether to stop things that we've already started, we tend to get to even thinking about it pretty late. So
the fact you're even thinking about it is a tell.
It's a tell. And, so Stephen Levitt, Freakonomics, he did a really fun thing where he put up a website, and he basically said, for people thinking about like whether they wanted to quit their job, you could go to that website and you could flip a coin to decide for you. So think about it like heads, you don't quit your job, tails, you quit your job. So obviously, if you're willing to go do that, you think it's like a 50-50 decision. And by 50-50, what I mean is you think it's equally likely that you will be happier staying in your job as it will be that you'll be happier leaving your job. So that's kind of when you get to that point of like, oh, I'm kind of torn. All right, let's flip a coin. You're experiencing it as a 50-50 choice, right? So if that's the case, then when the coin tells you to go quit, you should expect, when you ask people later, how happy are you? You should expect those people to be just as happy as the people who the coin told to stay. And that's not what they find at all. What they find is that when you go check in with them like 6 months later, this is a lot of people, it's like 20,000 people, that they're happier. So what that tells you is that when we experience it as a 50-50 choice, the scale is actually really super tilted toward quitting. So that's why when you start to have those feelings, you should really be exploring. The other reason that you should be exploring is that we just sort of are afraid of the unknown, right? Like we'd rather, that thing, like we'd rather take the devil you know than the devil you don't. And so what happens is that when we're thinking about switching to something new, we really get focused on the bad things that could come from it in a way that we don't focus on the good things that can come from it. So, I was talking to this wonderful woman. Her name is Dr. Sarah Olson Martinez. She was an ER doc, and she got in touch with me because she had this very question. She had been thinking about quitting her job. She had actually been promoted to being a hospital administrator, and she was thinking about quitting her job. She actually had another job offer with an insurance company, but she didn't know whether she should quit. So she called me up at my invitation. I was like, hey, let's talk about this, because I was writing this book. And she starts telling me how much she hates her job. And it's really awful, and it takes time away from her kids, and she feels like she's not present at home, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, all this stuff. And I'm thinking, like, wait, I don't understand. Like, why are we having this?
Where is the argument for staying?
Right. Like, she's asking me whether she should quit. Where's the question? So I said to her, okay, it seems like you're pretty unhappy. What's holding you back from quitting and going to the new job? And she said something very interesting that I think will probably resonate with people listening. She said, what if I take the new job and I hate that too? And I thought that was so interesting, right? So that's that fear that we have of bad things that come from something new that will
Sure.
stop us from actually quitting things that we know are bad, right? So what I said to her was, okay, I want you to imagine it's a year from now and you stayed in your current position. What's the probability that you'll be happy? She said, well, it's 0. And I said, well, why? Why do you think it's a 0% chance you'll be happy? She said, because I've been unhappy for a few years. So I kind of know what the future is going to hold. So I said, okay, imagine you take the new job. What do you think the chances are that
Probably
you'll be
higher
happy
than
then?
0.
50%. That's what she said.
Oh, wow.
So I said, is 50% greater than 0? And she said, oh. And she literally quit the next day once I had framed it that way. So I think this is the first rule, is that when you start thinking about quitting something, it's probably farther along to yes than you actually think it is.
Your
Right?
mind won't let you consider it. It's interesting because in an earlier episode that we did on firing people, less comfortable
Which
topic,
is quitting.
but it was, sure, you're right. Firing people is quitting the person you've hired. And
Exactly.
my experience as a manager was exactly that. By the time you start thinking to yourself, should I? It's already too late at that
It's
point.
already so far gone, right? So exactly. So I actually talk about firing in the book because we don't think about firing as quitting, but it is quitting. And the same problems that you have with firing people are the problems that we have with quitting other things. Because once you started something, we don't like to stop it. There's like a whole host of biases that stop us from stopping things. Probably the most well-known of those is the sunk cost fallacy, the
Sure.
sunk cost bias, which is, but I've put so much into it, I'll have wasted, what if I've wasted all the time in my training and getting to know the culture and all the hard work that I've put into this company. And it's like, yeah, but you already did that. Like that's already stuff that's gone. Waste is not a backwards looking problem, even though that's what we focus on. It's a prospective problem. Do I want to waste the next day, right? In this job or in this relationship or whatever. So that's the first thing. Is the same thing with the firing problem. When you've thought about it, when it starts to be like sort of intruding on your thoughts, you're probably pretty past where it's probably right to walk away. That being said, I want people to do 2 things when they have this thought. The first is that I want them to go talk to somebody who's a reasonable outside view. And the reason for that is that, like, you could imagine like a 21-year-old coming to you and saying, I'm going to quit because they haven't promoted me yet. And Roy, you, as someone who has lots of experience and maybe a better point of view on this, might say, look,
Give it a
you're
month.
21, you've been in the job for 6 months.
Right.
You got to have some patience. So
Sure.
it's really helpful to go talk to someone on the outside and say, look, I really don't know what to do here. You're an expert or you're a mentor, maybe even a therapist or somebody, and say, is it reasonable what I'm feeling? What should my expectations be that are reasonable? So I call that a quitting coach. So you should always go find somebody to
Oh, I
talk
love
to.
that.
Very important. Daniel Kahneman, by the way, the Nobel laureate, told me his quitting coach is Richard Thaler, also a Nobel laureate. We should be so lucky.
It helps. Yeah.
That helps. Okay. Now, the second thing is this, that when you have that moment of feeling like you want to quit, and this would be true if you're thinking about firing somebody too, you should go through this process. I'm thinking about quitting. The first thing you should do is set a deadline. It's very important. So you should say, how long am I okay with the situation as it stands? Okay. So maybe you say, I'm okay with it for 2 months. It's really important to have that deadline because otherwise you get into that tomorrow is another day problem. It's always, well, maybe it will be better tomorrow. Maybe it will be better tomorrow.
Sure.
So set a deadline. Let's say it's 6 weeks, 2 months. Okay.
Is this the quitting contract idea?
This is this idea of a pre-commitment contract, right? With a date. So now you're going to say, at that date, what state should I be in?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you want to combine.
If the following things have happened, then I'll stay. If they've not, it's actually very similar to founders who think about whether to exit a line of business that they're in, is sort of, because you'll always see some positives and some negatives, but the honesty of what I would have said back when I wrote it down is unforgiving.
Right. So exactly. So we want to think about 2 months from now, what are the benchmarks that I will have exceeded? Like what will my feelings be when I'm going into work? What will my relationship with my boss be? How productive will I feel, how fulfilled, in order for me to feel like I should stay? And if I'm below that, then those would be what I call kill criteria, which means that you ought to exit. So I think one of the best examples of this in sort of practice actually comes from Ron Conway, founder of SV Angel. And he said, founders never want to quit anything. It's actually part of sort of the DNA of a founder. So as an angel investor, he could see more clearly than they could when it was time to sort of exit a line of business or maybe even exit the company. And so what he would do when he could see it was he would sit down and say, well, how long are we okay with things as they are? Because like if you say to the person, like maybe it's time to exit, they're always going to say, I can turn it around. And he would say, I'm sure you can. What does turn it around look like? So once he said, what does turn it around look like within what time period? Now he as a quitting coach has level set them. And it's like, okay, you have to have generated, this much net new ARR or be on track in terms of this project or whatever, right? So he would figure out what those benchmarks were, the kill criteria. And now notice, to your point, they now have created a pre-commitment contract, right? Which just means I've pre-committed to certain actions if certain things are occurring in the future, and they're accountable to their quitting coach, who is Ron Conway. So interestingly enough, for a guy who was, early into Facebook and Uber and, obviously incredibly famous investor, he said the thing that he's most proud of is getting founders to realize when they ought to walk away.
Yeah,
because he realizes it's so hard.
There's a lot of masochism involved, and sometimes what they're really looking for. The other thing is, in that case, he's not a neutral quitting coach, because as an investor, that's one of the people who the founder doesn't want to let down. And so often I've found that recognizing when you have a power dynamic, even if like I think of founders as my customers, I'm trying to serve them, but they may not think of me that way. Just the permission to say, you know what, it's okay with me if you decide, because, it can be really powerful. The other thing that occurs to me is that the expectations are really different for different kinds of roles. I mean, for example, I've seen cases where somebody takes a job that they think is supposed to only be a 2 or 3 year job. And then they start thinking, I should really go, shouldn't I? When sometimes then the right answer is that their biases are pushing them to leave, and that in fact they should think about whether staying is the right answer. And so I just want to make sure folks hear you as make sure you're aware of what the underlying biases are and how to correct them, as opposed to you should generally be quitting, because that's
so let me explain. So the reason why I kind of focus on the quitting side of things is that as much as we talk about grit as a really important characteristic to develop, that's much more true for children.
Yeah.
Right. Totally. Children are not particularly gritty. Once you get above 25,
interesting,
it's mostly that you stick to things too long. So I tend to frame it that way.
Yeah, I love that.
Said, what you just said is totally true. That if you have a good quitting coach, right? If you have someone good to mentor you through the process, and you set these benchmarks, right? Like what needs to be true, that's also going to get you to stick to things that you might otherwise quit. So it's actually going to help you. It's a calibration problem. And the fact is that broadly speaking, like in general, we tend to be miscalibrated towards sticking. But the fact is that sometimes we go the other direction and we quit things too soon, maybe for the reason that you just pointed out. And so if we can get well calibrated through setting these pre-commitment contracts with these kill criteria with a good outside view to help us really level set, that can be really helpful. And then you can think about doing some reframing as well. So one of my favorite things is from Stuart Butterfield, the founder of Slack, who prior to Slack was actually creating a game called Glitch.
Sure.
And he saw long before anybody else did, including his investors, that Glitch wasn't going to be venture scale. And so he was leaving it. And I think he said one of the smartest things, that a lot of times when you're thinking about shutting a company down, you feel like you have this really strong obligation to your employees, right? Like, what am I going to do? I'm letting them down. They're not going to have a job, so on and so forth. But he actually reframed it in a way that I think was so brilliant. He said, I've got these people who are working for much less cash comp than they could get at an enterprise.
Got to be doing something that's worth it.
Right. They're actually working mainly for equity. And I figured out, me personally, I figured out the equity isn't worth it. So if I don't shut it down, that's not fair to them. Because they're working for equity that they think is worth it. And I know it's not worth it.
I love those reframes. I'll just say something you raised earlier made me think, you ask somebody 6 months later how they're doing, their perspective is often really different. A technique I've used with people is just an empathy technique. I call it the train to the future, which is imagine you've left. Instead of focusing on the moment of decision, focus on where you are 6 months from now under either choice, and just try to deeply think about what is your life like? What is the experience? And oftentimes then people can get a little release and a little clarity. And of course, the saving grace in this before we wrap is nobody will end up knowing if you made the right choice because you can't go back and rerun the
Well,
experiment.
you
You only have
definitely
one life to live.
you can't go back in time. But what I would encourage people to do is to realize that every second, every dollar, every bit of effort, every bit of attention that you put into something that is no longer worthwhile to you is time,
I
attention,
love
effort,
that. You
money
could
that you
be
can't
putting
put into
elsewhere.
something that might be great.
I love that. Well, and if folks want to see more, you can get the book here at bit.ly, Quit by Annie Duke. And I, in a way, when I first heard that you were writing this book now, I guess it was 2 years ago or something like that, I thought, wow, like, seems like folding in a poker hand and,
Yep.
pushing people to, sure. But now that I hear you talk about it, I hear that there's actually a profound motivation of valuing the person and their time
Yes.
and their efforts. So thank
My
you.
own time, other people's time.
Love it.
It's so important. And we don't value the alternative versions of ourselves in a way that
Right.
we
As
should.
much as we should, because these are harder to imagine. Any other parting thoughts before we wrap?
Gosh, other parting thoughts before we wrap. That feels like so much pressure.
Well, no, you could just say
No,
thank you.
no,
Okay.
it's not too much pressure. This is what I would say. I think goals are great, right? They motivate you, they give you a North Star. But I just want to warn people that goals can really actually be kind of deadly because the goal is supposed to be a proxy for achieving things that we value. But things shift, like facts on the ground change, and a goal that we've set may no longer actually be helping us to achieve things that we value, but the goal becomes the object itself. So what I would encourage people to do is when you have goals, and that might have to do with achievement that you're trying to, things you're trying to achieve at work that are stopping you from walking away from a bad situation, for example. What I would encourage people to do is have a goal, but always have unlesses attached to it. Like, this is my goal, unless I see this stuff, because we have to remember that the
The
goal
world
is just a
changes.
proxy,
Yeah.
right? Which I just think is like so incredibly important. The other thing that I really want to leave people with is that grit in and of itself is not a virtue. I hear from people all the time who are in situations with like toxic bosses who are like, but I can't quit because I need to grit it out and show that I'm tough and like build that character muscle. And I'm like, no, grit is a virtue if it gets you to stick to things that are
Right. And
hard
there's
but
nobody
worthwhile.
watching in some book scoring you on grit. It's
That's
a means
exactly
to an
right.
end.
Like, a virtue is to take care of yourself and get into situations that are going to make you happy. That's really
I'll
what we're
tell
trying
you.
to
I
do.
love that, Annie. All right. Thank you for this. And for those watching for the first time, it's not advice because we don't know exactly what you should do in your
No,
situation. We're sharing our ways of thinking about it. And Annie, I'd love to do more in the future. And I hope we see each other on more cap tables and to be
yes,
continued.
love it. Thank
Thank
you. Thank you so
you.
much for having me.
Oh, no, that was so